Chapter 12, Present-day Trotskyism. Since the time of Lenin, Trotskyites have engaged in so much falsification of history that they are rendered unable to produce anything viable. It is no wonder there has never been a Trotskyist revolution anywhere on this planet. Scholars have shown that Trotskyites bear the responsibility for, quote, the creation of an anti-Bolshevik bloc in the pre-October period, the formation of factions in the party in the 20s, anti-republican maneuvers in the years of the Civil War in Spain, actual cooperation with the forces of fascism on the eve of the Second World War, as well as provocations in Peru between 1963 and 1966 and in France in 1968, end quote. The list continues. During the Korean War, the supporters of Trotskyites Tony Cliff maintained a strict neutrality and blamed US imperialism and, quote, Russian imperialism, end quote, equally for the war. In the light of recent revelations of US-backed incursions into North Korea's before the war and US atrocities against Korean civilians doing it, such a position seems outlandish. Trotskyism as an ideology infiltrates the ranks of the working class movement as a willing agent of the ruling class. It is used to the advantage of the enemies, the proletariat as such this day as it was in the past. Trotskyites today still support the same political program as the bourgeoisie. Trotskyites are in fact bourgeois politicians and work for the imperialists. Still, they find themselves unable to team up with anyone in America or whichever country they inhabit. So they choose to act like communists and claim the crown of communism. Everyone who studies their political line knows no Trotskyist article is ever written without attacking Stalinism and the bourgeois equality. Here they express a love for the counter-revolutionary line of Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev and Yeltsin by saying that the liquidation of socialism in the USSR led to the, quote, removal of an obstacle, end quote, for the Trotskyist movement in Korea. In other words, the restoration of capitalism was a good thing. The article, which again is supposedly on the political situation in South Korea, goes on to hail the DPRK as, quote, the worst of Stalinists, end quote. Quote, the North Korean leadership increasingly adopted a personality cult around Kim Il-sung. The regime is among the worst Stalinists in terms of opposition to workers' democracy and political strategy. They don't understand that South Korea is capitalist. For example, they orient towards a mythical struggle against feudalism, claiming that South Korea is semi-feudal, end quote. Quote, we would like to have contact with North Korean workers, but they is no dissident group of revolutionary workers. What dissidents there are have no base in the working class. Workers so far are absolutely controlled by the party, end quote. Not only does this quote show that Trotskyites are actively trying to overthrow the anti-imperialist government of the DPRK in service of the bourgeoisie, but it also shows that despite their wishes, the Korean people are unanimously behind the Workers' Party of Korea. Once again, they favor imperialism over, quote, Stalinism, end quote. The Trotskyites once again enter into open unity with Washington on the question of Iranian politics. Quote, "It should go without saying that socialists anywhere in the world must stand on the side of the Iranian popular democratic resistance to elect fraud, violent repression and tyranny." End quote. Trotskyism was a movement of splits. Despite the constant attempts to form the new international, the Fourth International, today there are various groups that are characterized as Trotskyist, as well as groups that agree with their theoretical positions and move around a common tradition of which Trotskyism is a part. The starting point of further splits in the traditional Trotskyist groups and the formation of so-called neo-Trotskyism was the 1950s, when Tony Cliff formulated his theory of state capitalism, referring to the nature of the state structure of the USSR. While Trotsky characterized the Soviet Union as a deformed worker state, the basis of neo-Trotskyism is the international socialist tendency created in 1977. At the international level, there are also similar international Trotskyist centers, which include almost all groups that act as Trotskyists at the level of one country. The history of the Trotskyists in France in the 1950s to 70s and today is inactive. The various Trotskyist groups have close ties to social democracy and are the cradle of cadres, such as Lionel Jospin. They have carried out such extensive anti-communist activities that Le Monde has described them as a, quote, left anti-communist current, end quote. Nowadays, the Trotskyists, taking advantage of the opportunistic degeneration of the PCF, are laying claim to a large role, receiving a significant number of votes in various elections. They criticize the PCF, while caring about good relations with the right-wing elements in it, and in the CGT declaring their commitment to the bourgeois system and their intentions to participate in left-centrist coalitions. It is significant that one of their main groups, the so-called League of Communist Revolutionaries, in cooperation with the second main group called Workers' Struggle, removed from its program the goal of winning the dictatorship of the proletariat, characterizing it as so-called Stalinist. Various marginal Trotskyist groups in Greece: the Revolutionary Workers' Party, the Organization of International Communists of Greece, the Communist Union, Workers' Power, START, etc. The Socialist Workers' Party, formerly the Organization of the Socialist Revolution, is stronger. Their activity is mainly manifested through the distribution of their newspaper. Many of their activists appear in the bourgeois press. According to their positions and ideological and political characteristics, they can be classified as the so-called neo-Trotskyists. The Socialist Workers' Party in Greek section of the International Socialist Tendency. It is probably the largest section of the tendency in Europe, after the British Socialist Workers' Party. It was formed by a group of students who found themselves in London in 1967, after the establishment of the regime of the black colonials. They were intentionally influenced by Maoism and formed a political organization called the Organization for Socialist Revolution. During their stay in London, the organization came into contact with Tony Cliff's International Socialists, after which they came under the influence of Trotskyism, which the latter represents. By the time the activists of the organization returned to Greece, their contact with the International Socialists had been lost, but was renewed in the early 1980s. By the time, the latter had already renamed itself the Socialist Workers' Party. In the late 1990s, the organization was renamed the Socialist Workers' Party. In the 1970s, they republished the magazine Midwife, and later, and to this day, the SWP publishes the newspaper Workers' Solidarity and the magazine Socialism from Below. The SWP was on the rise from 1989 to 1993, i.e., during the period of coups and the victory of the counter-revolution in the socialist countries. Since that, it has fallen into a prolonged crisis and a half-dead state, which cannot be considered without taking into account the reorganization of class forces in the country. In 1901, a split occurred in the SWP. One part formed the Internationalist Workers' Left, the ILL, which is ideologically as politically linked to the American section of the Tendency, which also split from Tendency. The IRL participated in the formation of the coalition of the radical left and the coalition of the SIN party, the coalition of left forces. Chapter 13: Attitude towards the imperialist structure of the European Union. A characteristic feature of all Trotskyist groups is the almost complete absence of identification of the imperialist character of the European Union. This topic is presented in their documents very limitedly. Moreover, they previously actively attacked the KKE in Greece for its position against the EU, considering that this position is nationalist, expressing the interests of the Greek bourgeoisie, striving to occupy a more adventuristic place in the system of international imperialism. The question of the struggle against the EU is not raised anymore, since such a goal is connected with the Leninist, not Trotskyist, analysis of imperialism, with the Leninist theory of uneven development, with the theory of the weak link of imperialism and the possibility of carrying out and winning a revolution in one country. On the other hand, the creation of the European Union is considered by various Trotskyist currents as a field of class struggle, and this fact defends their position of the transition of class struggle from the national to the regional level and their theory of world revolution. However, Trotsky himself was one of the main inspirers of the slogan about the United States of Europe, under the influence of Kautsky's ultra-imperialism. Lenin rejected this slogan in his work on the slogan United States of Europe, clearly stating that the adoption of such a slogan would mean rejecting the law of uneven development and the possibility of the victory of socialism in one country. At the same time, their support and active and energetic participation in the European social forums that support this slogan, "Another Europe is possible," classified them as apologists of European imperialism and makes them part of contemporary European social chauvinism, which is expressed through an attempt to support the European imperialist center as an opponent of the USA. Ultimately, the anti-communism of the Trotskyist groups not only brings them closer to the social democrats and the opportunist politics of the New Left, but also the reactionary propaganda and practice. Despite their extreme smallness, it should not be underestimated that their Marxism grab provides a revolutionary cover for the dominant bourgeois ideology. The bourgeoisie used them, as well as all currents of right and left opportunism, to subjugate the radical tendencies emerging in the workers' and youth movements. Trotskyism is caused by profound ignorance of both social sciences and philosophy, unwillingness to deploy and thoughtfully understand serious problems and seek solutions, arrogance and self-praises. The works of both Trotsky and his modern followers are characterized by an incorrect selection of facts. Only facts that confirm the author's point of view are taken. Facts are taken out of context. Unimportant facts are given key importance, etc. Artificially and standing conclusions slip through everything and everywhere in the works, and a weak knowledge of Marxism. The general impression from the works of the Trotskyists is water pouring from empty to empty, covered up with beautiful theories and phrases. Trotskyists are a selected detachment of the bourgeoisie in the world revolutionary movement, whose task is to neutralize the revolutionary movement by decomposing it from within, not allowing it to consolidate, organize, gather all the forces of the workers into a single fist in order to rid humanity once and for all of exploitation and oppression. Why do Trotskyists hate Stalin and his policies so much? Because Stalin's policies are the dictatorship of the proletariat in its most obvious form, the very one under which the bourgeoisie cannot survive. On a sincere fight for socialism and communism will not hate Stalin and Stalin's policies, because this is precisely the policy through which the path to communism lies. Every true communist understands this, and anyone who does not want to understand this cannot be a communist by definition. Trotskyism was utterly defeated in its time. This was a great merit of Vladimir Lenin, Stalin, the CPSU and the Communist parties in the Comintern. Now, after the collapse of the USSR and the countries of socialism, Trotskyism has once again raised its head, trying to revive in other forms and other variants. But its essence remains the same and its goals are still the same. To split the world revolutionary movement, disarm it, lead it away from the only true path of struggle for socialism. And therefore, it is the duty of every communist and every communist or workers' party to wage the most irreconcilable struggle against Trotskyism, exposing its vile, provocative essence before all workers and oppressed people, striving for a revolutionary transformation of the existing society. Chapter 14: Factionalism and splits in the workers' movements, fundamental characteristics of Trotskyism. The split of the revolutionary movement of the working class is one of the characteristic goals and distinguishing features of modern Trotskyism. Objectively, the Trotskyism of our time can be characterized as a special organ in the service of the bourgeoisie for splitting the workers' movement, a split that the Trotskyists strive to elevate to the principle, openly opposing unity in their ranks. One of the current leaders and ideologists of Trotskyism, Pierre Frank, writes, quote, "In fact, what is abnormal in the workers' movement is monolithically the unity that stifles any independent political thought in the ranks of the so-called Marxist organizations. From the example of the history of the workers' movement, one can see that this is often present, since its history is full of the struggle of tendencies and currents that are in theoretical and political opposition to each other. This is normal because the progress of revolutionary action and revolutionary thought cannot be conceived outside the continuous confrontation of theories located and oriented towards reality, especially in a world in a state of continuous fluctuations in which something new appears and arises every day." End quote. Therefore, in his opinion, there can be no talk of unity in the workers' movement. Its normal situation will be constant split. From this, the concept of a constant split in many ranks of the Trotskyist movement is understandable. Its continuous dismemberment into a long list of groups and factions where they disunite each other, which is not only a manifestation of weakness and petty bourgeoisie, but also a tactic of sowing discord and disintegration in the ranks of the revolutionary workers' movement. Note from the Union of Red Front Soldiers: how can one explain to the reader what a faction in the party is? In the word of the remarkable Spanish Marxist-Leninist Pedro Checa, quote, "What is a faction? A faction is a group that is organized or functions outside the rules defined by the party status. A cell, a meeting, a conference, etc. on the basis of its own platform and internal discipline. Of course, factions as such are not born ready-made. They are created through groups, friendly militant associations, parties, etc., which by coinciding its criticism or in the struggle against certain comrades or party organs take shape and develop." End quote. One of the differences between Trotskyism and Leninism in the organizational conception of the party was the question of whether the permanent faction in the party, i.e. platforms, parallel to the legitimate leadership elected by the organs of the party itself, as we saw it in the previous definition. Lenin explains his position on the phenomenon as follows, quote, "It is necessary that all class-conscious workers clearly realize the harm and inadmissibility of any factionalism, which, even with all the desire of the representatives of individual groups to preserve party unity, inevitably leads in practice to the weakening of harmonious work and the repeated intensified attempts by enemies of the governing party who are attaching themselves to it, to deepen the division and use it for the purpose of counter-revolution. The Congress therefore declares dissolved and order to immediate dissolute of all groups within exception that have formed on one or another platform, such as the Workers' Opposition Group, Democratic Centralism Group, etc. Failure to carry out this resolution of the Congress must entail unconditional and immediate expulsion from the party. End quote. Lenin said this at the 10th Congress of the RCP Bolsheviks. However, Trotskyism, in the person of its leader, declared, quote, "The Fourth International has never banned factions, and those not intended to do so. Factions have existed and will exist among us all." End quote. And this was not a turn of Trotskyism. It was the essence of its main leader from the moment of its inception. We now consider Martov one of the leaders of liquidationism. All the more dangerous, the more skillfully he defends the liquidors with quasi-Marxist words, but Martov openly expounds views that left their imprints on entire currents in the mass workers' movement of the 1903 to 1910. Trotsky, however, presents only his personal hesitations and nothing more. In 1903 he was a Menshevik. He left Menshevism in 1904, returned to the Mensheviks in 1905, flaunting only ultra-revolutionary phrases. In 1906 he left again. At the end of 1906 he defended the election agreements with the cadets, i.e. in fact he was against with the Mensheviks. And in the spring of 1907, at the London Congress, he said that his differences with Rosa Luxemburg is rather a difference of individual shades than of political directions. Trotsky plagiarized today from the ideological baggage of one faction, tomorrow from another, and therefore declares himself to be above both factions. Chapter 15. Features of modern Trotskyism and the circumstances of its revival. The need to fight against Trotskyism as a saboteur of the proletarian revolution. The development of the revolutionary movement of the working class in our days. As the 6th Congress of the Albanian Party of Labour noted, necessarily requires a consistent struggle both against right-wing opportunism and modern revisionism, which in the most important, and against the left currents, especially against the dangerous activities of Trotskyism, which became especially active in the 1960s. In his report to the 6th Congress, Comrade Enver Hoxha said, quote, "Various anti-Marxist Trotskyists and anarchist currents have revived again. By penetrating various mass movements, especially youth and intellectual ones, they are trying to finish in troubled waters, trying to distract the masses from the right path and push them onto the path of serious defeats and illusions." End quote. Reasons for the revival of Trotskyism after the 20th and especially after the 22nd Congress of the CPSU, when the renegade Khrushchev began a wild anti-Stalinist campaign. Trotskyism, which had suffered serious losses and lost all influence, raised its head again and resumed its subversive activity, putting forth its poisonous shoots in many countries in the world. Like mushrooms after rain, Trotskyist groups and organizations began to appear in Europe and America. The main reasons for the modern revival of Trotskyism: firstly, it is connected with the involvement of the modern revolutionary movement of a large number of urban petit bourgeois, small traders, intellectuals, students, labor aristocrats, who brought to the movement all the characteristics of the petit bourgeoisie. These characteristics, petit bourgeois instability, the tendency to rush from one extreme to another, from anarchism to the extreme right opposition, and liquidationism, constitute and fertile ground on which Trotskyism flourishes, and which it used for its counter-revolutionary goals. Secondly, in the present period, when the wave of the revolutionary movement is growing, the bourgeoisie supports all ways and means, including Trotskyism, in order to exploit the protests of the broad masses of the working class, youth and students against the capitalist order, their sincere but spontaneous revolutionary sentiments, to disorient them with revolutionary phraseology and lead them astray and away from the true path of revolution, pushing them into actions that are not dangerous for the bourgeoisie and which will cause disappointment. This is the reason why publishing houses owned by the bourgeoisie today print and distribute Trotskyist works and Trotskyist literature in huge quantities. Chapter 16: Some essential features of modern Trotskyism. What characterizes modern Trotskyism? What is the role of this anti-Marxist trend in the modern conditions of development of the revolutionary movement? Trotskyism of our days is generally based on the anti-Marxist views and methods used in his time by Trotsky. But at the same time, it has some new features and nuances that have appeared in the modern conditions and circumstances of development of the activities of the Trotskyists. Numerous Trotskyist groups are constantly at odds with each other, but are united on some fundamental issues in their struggle against Marxism-Leninism and the revolutionary movement. From a philosophical point of view, modern Trotskyism, like the previous one, is characterized by voluntarism, subjectivism, which are expressed, among other things, in the refusal to take into account the objective conditions of development of the revolutionary movement and the national and international levels, the refusal to take into account the characters and driving focus of the revolution at its various stages. The concepts of the Trotskyists are also characterized by eclecticism, the absence of stable principles, the combination of completely opposite concepts, unification within most diverse currents for the sake of advantages, etc. From an ideological political point of view, modern Trotskyism is characterized first of all by its hostility to revolutionary Marxism-Leninism. This is a common feature of both the old and the new Trotskyism. Previously, this found expression in the malicious attack of Trotsky and the Trotskyists on Stalin, his ideas, activities and leadership. In our time, the hostility of Trotskyism towards Leninism is expressed in the fact that the Trotskyists strive to distract the attention of the revolutionary movement from the struggle against modern revisionism and push it towards the position of anti-Stalinism. The Trotskyists present Stalin's Marxism-Leninism in a completely false light, calling it right-wing opportunist, loudly accusing Stalin and Stalinism of betraying Leninism, rolling back the revolutionary wave in the West, occupying and exploiting the countries of people's democracy after the Second World War, etc. They also attack Mao, the Communist Party of China, and the Chinese Revolution. At the same time, they remain silent or speak in general terms about the struggle against revisionism, while fully agreeing on fundamental issues with modern revisionists, together with them attack on Stalin and the Communist Party of China, support various revisionist currents. In 1948, the leadership of the largest of the four international and the Trotskyist organizations belonging to its supporters to the Yugoslav revisionists and launched large-scale activities in their support. In 1956, the Trotskyists sided with the Hungarian counter-revolution. The Trotskyists deny the process of restoration of capitalism in the revisionist-ruled countries, participate in the demagogy of the Soviet revisionists about the united front of all socialist countries against American imperialism, etc. In Lenin's words, maneuver, speculate, pose as leftists and help the rightists as such as they can. The Trotskyists seek to unite all currents, right or left, against revolutionary Marxism-Leninism, which they just call Stalinism, and thereby consciously try to split the revolutionary movement of the working class. Objectively, the Trotskyism of our time can be called a special agency in the service of the bourgeoisie for splitting the workers' movement, a split which the Trotskyists elevate to a principle openly opposing unity in its ranks. The constant split within the ranks of the Trotskyist movement itself, their conditionless division into a larger number of groups and factions at odds with each other, are not only an expression of their weakness and petty bourgeois character, but also a tactic for introducing discord and division into the ranks of the revolutionary movement. Unprincipled collaboration and unification with both the extreme right oppositionists and the left is typical of Trotskyism. On the one hand, many of them pursue the so-called policy of adventurism, joined the right-wing social democratic parties, while on the other hand they fiercely attack the policies of the anti-fascist popular fronts, calling them the opportunist policy of class compromise. At the same time, they often recommend to the workers' movement such strategy and tactics in the struggle for socialism that are ideological to the reformist line of the right wing of the revisionists. All this shows that the fundamental political characteristic of modern Trotskyism is the same as that of the former: revolution in words and the undermining of the revolutionary movement in practice. Modern Trotskyism is the sworn enemy of the revolutionary movement of the working class and the people's and the dangerous weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie, and the monopolies for undermining this movement. Therefore, in modern conditions, the struggle to destroy Trotskyist current is relevant and necessary for the successful development of the revolutionary movement of the working class, and is an urgent task for the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists. The struggle for the ideological and political exposure of the falseness and counter-revolutionary character of Trotskyist doctrines and organizations will be long and complex in view of the various problems of the modern revolutionary movement, but this struggle itself is not enough. The defeat of Trotskyist current is inseparable from the struggle of Marxist-Leninist parties against modern revisionism, especially Soviet revisionism, and overcoming the confusion it has brought to the modern revolutionary movement, including by creating conditions to the revival of Trotskyism and Trotskyist speculations. By the decisive conditions for a successful struggle against Trotskyism in the future development of the Marxist-Leninist movement itself, the development in each country of a genuine program of revolutionary struggle, the expansion of the influence of Marxist parties on the masses.